While all of these silly things were going on, I thought it best to keep my comparative theory of superpower collapse to myself. During that time, I was watching the action in the oil industry because I understood that oil imports are the Achilles heel of the US economy. In the mid-1990s, the all-time peak in global oil production was scheduled for the turn of the century. But then a lot of things happened that delayed it by at least half a decade. Perhaps you've noticed this too. There is a certain refrain here. People who try to predict big historical shifts always turn out to be off by about half a decade. Unsuccessful predictions, on the other hand, are always spot on as far as timing. The world as we know it failed to end precisely at midnight on January 1st, year 2000. Perhaps there is a physical principle involved. Information spreads at the speed of light, while ignorance is instantaneous at all points in the known universe. So please make a mental note. Whenever it seems to you that I'm making a specific prediction as to when I think something is likely to happen, just silently add plus or minus half a decade. In any case, about half a decade ago, I finally thought that the time was ripe, and as it turned out, I wasn't too far off. In June of 2005, I published an article on the subject titled Post-Soviet Lessons for a Post-American Century, which was quite popular, even to the extent that I got paid for it. It is available at various places on the internet. A little while later, I formalized my thinking somewhat into the collapse gap concept, which I presented at a conference in Manhattan in April of 2006. The slideshow from that presentation, titled Closing the Collapse Gap, was posted on the internet and has been downloaded a few million times since then. Then in January of 2008, when it became apparent to me that financial collapse was well underway and that other stages of collapse were to follow, I published a short article titled The 5 Stages of Collapse, which I later expanded into a talk I gave at a conference in Michigan in October of 2008. Finally, at the end of 2008, I announced on my blog that I'm getting out of the prognosticating business. I made enough predictions, and they all seem to be very well on track, give or take half a decade. Please remember that. Collapse is well underway, and now I'm just an observer. But this talk is about something else, something other than making dire predictions and then acting all smug when they come true. You see, there's nothing more useless than predictions once they have come true. It's like looking at last year's amazingly successful stock picks. What are you going to do about them this year? What we need are examples of things that have been shown to work in the strange, unfamiliar post-collapse environment that we're all likely to have to confront. Stuart Brand proposed the title for the talk, Social Collapse Best Practices, and I thought it was an excellent idea. Although the term best practices has been diluted over time to mean little more than good ideas, initially it stood for the process of abstracting useful techniques from examples of what has worked in the past and applying them to new situations in order to control risk, to increase the chances of securing a positive outcome. It's a way of skipping a lot of trial and error and deliberation and experimentation and to just go with what works. In organizations, especially large organizations, best practices also offers a good way to avoid painful episodes of watching colleagues trying to think out of the box whenever they're confronted with a new problem. If your colleagues were any good at thinking outside the box, they probably wouldn't feel so compelled their entire working lives sitting in a box, keeping an office chair warm. If they were any good at thinking outside the box, they would have by now thought of a way to escape from that box. So perhaps what would make them feel happy and productive again is if someone came along and gave them a different box in which to think, you know, a box better suited to the post-collapse environment. Here's a key insight. You might think that when collapse happens, nothing works. That's just not the case. The old ways of doing things don't work anymore. The old assumptions are all invalidated. Conventional goals and measures of success become irrelevant. But a different set of goals, techniques, and measures of success can be brought to bear immediately, and the sooner the better. But enough generalities. Let's go through some specifics. We'll start with some generalities, and as you'll see, it will all become very, very specific rather quickly. Here's another key insight. There are very few things that are positives or negatives per se. Just about everything is a matter of context. Now, it just so happens that most things that are positives prior to collapse turn out to be negatives once collapse occurs, and vice versa. For instance, prior to collapse, having high inventory in a business is bad, because the businesses have to store it and finance it, so they try to have just-in-time inventory. After collapse, high inventory turns out to be very useful because they can barter it for the things they need, and they can't easily get more because they don't have any credit. Prior to collapse, it's good for a business to have the right level of staffing and an efficient organization. After collapse, what you want is a gigantic, sluggish bureaucracy that can't unwind operations or lay people off fast enough through sheer bureaucratic foot-dragging. Prior to collapse, what you want is an effective retail segment and good customer service. After collapse, you regret not having an unreliable retail segment with shortages and long bread lines, because then people would have been forced to learn to shift for themselves instead of standing around waiting for somebody to come and feed them. If you notice, none of the things I mentioned have any bearing on what is commonly understood as economic health. Prior to collapse, the overall macroeconomic positive is an expanding economy. After collapse, economic contraction is a given, and the overall macroeconomic positive becomes something of an imponderable, so we're forced to listen to a lot of nonsense. The situation is either slightly better than expected or slightly worse than expected. We're always either months or years from economic recovery. Business as usual will resume sooner or later because some television bobblehead said so. But let's take it apart. Starting from the very general, what are the current macroeconomic objectives if you listen to the hot air coming out of Washington at the moment? First, growth, of course. Get the economy going. We learned nothing from the last huge spike in commodity prices, so let's just try again. That calls for economic stimulus, aka printing money. Let's see how high the prices go this time. Maybe this time we will achieve hyperinflation. Second, stabilizing financial institutions. Getting banks lending, that's important too. You see, we're just not in enough debt yet. That's our problem. We need more debt, and quickly. Third, jobs. We need to create jobs. Low-wage jobs, of course, to replace all the high-wage manufacturing jobs that we've been shedding for decades now, and replacing them with low-wage service sector jobs, mainly ones without any job security or benefits. Right now, a lot of people could slow down the rate at which they're sinking further into debt if they quit their jobs. That is, their job is a net loss for them as individuals as well as for the economy as a whole. But of course, we need much more of that, and quickly. So that's where we are now. The ship is on the rocks, water is rising, and the captain is shouting, "Full steam ahead! We're sailing to Afghanistan." Do you listen to Ahab up on the bridge, or do you desert your post in the engine room and go help deploy the lifeboats? If you thought the previous episode of uncontrolled debt expansion, globalized Ponzi schemes, and economic hollowing out was silly, then I predict that you will find the next episode of feckless grasping at macroeconomic straws even sillier. Except that it won't be funny. What is crashing now is our life support system, all the systems and institutions that are keeping us alive. And so I don't recommend passively standing around and watching the show unless you happen to have a death wish. Right now, the Washington Economic Stimulus team is putting on their scuba gear and diving down to the engine room to try to invent a way to get a diesel engine to run on seawater. They spoke of change, but in reality, they're terrified of change and want to cling with all their might to the status quo. But this game will soon be over, and they don't have any idea what to do next. So what is there for them to do? Forget growth, forget jobs, forget financial stability. What should their realistic new objectives be? Well, here they are: food, shelter, transportation, and security. Their task is to find a way to provide all of these necessities on an emergency basis in absence of a functioning economy, with commerce at a standstill, with little or no access to imports, and to make them available to a population that is largely penniless.